Hello, Calling Up community. I'm Claudia Alick, and in today's video, Understanding Calling Up, we will review the following vocabulary: calling out, calling in, calling down, calling up. If you haven't already, please review the other video module, performativity and understanding or use of language. In that video module, it will just remind you that the words we're using are meant to help us have a shared understanding of these complicated concepts. They are not meant to encourage you to police other people's language. Here's the definition that we're using right now. Calling out is the act of publicly criticizing people for violating accepted behavioral standards. Calling in is the act of privately criticizing people for violating accepted behavioral standards. These are value neutral terms. Calling down is the practice of publicly or privately dismissing, denying, or obfuscating abusive, harassing, or oppressive behaviors in order to cultivate and support future negative behaviors and performances of injustice. Calling up is the practice of publicly and or privately acknowledging abusive, harassing, oppressive behaviors and participating in transformative justice processes to cultivate positive future behaviors. Now, when people are critiquing the call out, they are usually critiquing just a tiny piece of call out culture, right? So calling out is a value neutral term. The calling out can be done in a toxic way. It can become a performance of your own personal righteousness instead of a way to encourage healthier behavior for the people who are in your community. At its most negative, the call out is actually being used and weaponized to support call down culture. So you'll ironically see folks using the technique of calling out to call people out for calling out negative behaviors because they want these negative behaviors to continue. In the context of our practice, the call out is almost always necessary. When we witness a performance of injustice and don't interrupt it, then what we're communicating is that injustice and oppression are accepted behavioral standards. I understand calling out can feel awkward. We've been enculturated not to want to interrupt or disrupt, right? The show must go on. The meeting needs to end on time. You don't want to interrupt your elder. We have to remember, though, it's the person who did the negative act who did the first disruption. It was the negative action and the feelings people are feeling about it that are making it uncomfortable, and ignoring a problem does not solve a problem. In fact, it usually just creates a new one. Now, calling in, again, is a value-neutral term. In its most toxic forms, it can become more about caretaking the feelings of the person doing the oppressive behavior, or it can become an excuse to not actually have a culture of accountability and restorative justice. But at its best, it is so necessary. None of us are disposable. I really appreciate Lachlan Tran, and please forgive me if I'm mispronouncing their name. In Black Girl Dangerous, they give this beautiful framing, calling in as a practice of loving each other enough to allow each other to make mistakes and loving ourselves enough to know that what we're trying to do here is a radical unlearning of everything we have been configured to believe is normal. So I've used the words accepted behavioral standards as value neutral terminology in calling out and calling in. And you have to ask yourself, what are the accepted behavioral standards that you want to cultivate? Do you want to have a culture of calling down or calling up? Because calling up, calling out at its best is reinforcing accepted behavioral standards, cultivating performances of justice. Calling in at its best, it's helping the recipient of the critique to avoid a defensive public reaction that will cause more harm. However, successful calling up, it requires the person who's being called out or called in to participate positively. So that means you have to have a culture of calling up that has speaking up, accountability, active responsibility, and a belief in the possibility for change from those you are in community with and engaging with. Ultimately, calling up should be transformative to yourself and those around you. I hope that this vocabulary is useful for you as you continue to cultivate more performances of justice in real life.